I was on my way to a business trip, heading to a small town in the middle of nowhere. The flight had been delayed, and by the time I landed it was well past midnight. The airport was nearly deserted, its few remaining passengers scurrying towards exits or waiting impatiently for rides. My taxi ride from the airport to the hotel was uneventful, the driver silent except for a gruff greeting when I entered the car. We sped down empty roads, the headlights slicing through the darkness, illuminating fields and occasional clusters of trees. The small town was cloaked in a deep, almost unnatural stillness. When we finally pulled up to the hotel, I was struck by its appearance. It was a sleek, modern building that looked brand new. Its exterior was a blend of glass and steel, with sharp lines and a minimalist aesthetic. The kind of place that exuded efficiency and luxury. It was an incongruous sight in such a remote area, like a beacon of contemporary life in the middle of nowhere. The taxi driver unloaded my luggage and drove off without another word. I stood for a moment, staring at the hotel, a sense of unease creeping over me. The lobby was brightly lit, almost aggressively so, the lights spilling out into the darkness. I took a deep breath and walked through the automatic doors, which whooshed shut behind me. Inside, the lobby was pristine. The floor was polished to a mirror-like sheen, and the minimalist decor featured sleek furniture and abstract art pieces. Everything about the place screamed efficiency and order, yet there was something off about it. The air felt sterile, almost clinical, and there was a complete lack of any human warmth. A young receptionist stood behind the counter, her face pale and drawn. She gave me a strained smile as I approached, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "Welcome," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She quickly checked me in and handed me my key card. "Room 304, she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. I thanked her and made my way to the elevator, which opened silently at my approach. I stepped inside, and the doors closed with a soft hiss. The elevator was smooth and silent, gliding effortlessly to the third floor. The hallway was brightly lit, with pristine white walls and spotless carpeting. As I walked down the hallway, the silence felt oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When I reached my room, I was surprised to find the door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The room was immaculate, with sleek, modern furniture and a large, comfortable bed. As I reached the elevator, I heard a soft, mournful wail coming from down the hall. I didn't look back. I hit the button repeatedly until the elevator finally arrived. The ride down was agonizingly slow, and I felt like the walls were closing in on me. When I reached the lobby, the receptionist was gone. The front desk was deserted, and the lobby was eerily quiet. I left my key card on the counter and hurried outside. The night air was a relief, cold and fresh against my skin. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. There were no taxis in sight, and I didn't have the energy to call for one. Instead, I walked back to the airport, my mind racing with what I had experienced. The walk took longer than I expected, and by the time I reached the airport, I was exhausted. The airport was just starting to come to life, with early morning travelers arriving for their flights. I found a bench in a quiet corner and sat down, hugging my bag to my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the bustling terminal. The first flight out of the town was at dawn, and I booked a ticket without hesitation. I spent the next few hours in a daze, trying to make sense of what had happened. It felt surreal, like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. When my flight was finally called, I boarded with a sense of relief. As the plane took off, I looked down at the town, feeling a strange mix of fear and curiosity. The following day, I recounted my experience to my colleagues. We were gathered in a conference room, going over the details of our trip. As I spoke, I noticed one of my colleagues, a local named Sarah, growing increasingly pale. When I finished, she took a deep breath and spoke in a hushed voice. "That hotel has a dark history," she said. "Years ago, it was the site of a gruesome murder-suicide. A man killed his wife and children before taking his own life. Ever since then, guests have reported strange occurrences. Some say they've seen the ghosts of the victims, while others have experienced cold spots, whispers, and the feeling of being watched. A shiver ran down my spine as she spoke. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and I realized that what I had experienced wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The hotel was haunted, and I had been unlucky enough to experience it firsthand. Sarah continued, "The hotel was renovated a few years ago, but the hauntings never stopped. Locals avoid it, and it only stays in business because of travelers who don't know its history. You're not the first to have such an experience." I felt a mixture of relief and dread. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone in what I had experienced, but the idea that such a place existed was deeply unsettling. I vowed never to return to that town, and to this day, the memory of that night in room 304 still sends chills down my spine. Over the next few weeks, I tried to put the experience behind me. Work kept me busy, and I focused on the tasks at hand. But the memory of that night lingered in the back of my mind, a constant, nagging presence. I found myself researching haunted hotels and the paranormal, trying to make sense of what had happened. The more I learned, the more I realized how common such experiences were. Haunted hotels, especially those with tragic histories, seemed to attract a lot of attention. Stories of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and inexplicable cold spots were common. Yet, despite the prevalence of such stories, there was always a sense of skepticism. Many people dismissed these experiences as the product of overactive imaginations or psychological phenomena, but I knew what I had felt. The cold, the whispers, the pressure on the bed. These were not things I could easily explain away. I reached out to a paranormal investigator, hoping to get some answers. His name was David, and he had been studying hauntings for over a decade. We met at a cafe, and I recounted my experience to him in detail. He listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It sounds like a classic residual haunting," he said. "Residual hauntings are like recordings of past events. The energy of the traumatic event gets imprinted on the environment, and under the right conditions, it can replay itself. The cold spots, the whispers, the pressure on the bed. These are all common in such cases." "But why me?" I asked. "Why did it happen when I was there?" David shrugged. "It could be a number of factors. Sometimes people are more sensitive to these energies. Other times, it could be triggered by something as simple as a change in the weather or the time of year. Unfortunately, there's no way to predict or prevent it." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. It was comforting to have an explanation, but it didn't make the experience any less frightening. David gave me some advice on how to protect myself from future encounters, including carrying protective charms and practicing grounding techniques. As I left the cafe, I felt a sense of closure. The experience had been terrifying, but I had survived it. I had faced my fear and come out the other side. Over time, the memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the day-to-day concerns of life. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the deserted highway as I pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel. The neon sign flickered intermittently, spelling out "vacancy" in buzzing letters that seemed to echo the emptiness of the place. Despite the sinking feeling in my gut, exhaustion compelled me to stop for the night. I stepped out of my car and approached the reception area, a small shack with peeling paint and a flickering fluorescent light above the door. As I entered, a chill ran down my spine, and not just because of the cool night air. The receptionist, a gaunt figure with sunken eyes, looked up from his magazine with a toothy grin that sent a shiver down my spine. His voice was a low, raspy whisper as he handed me a rusty key and directed me to my room at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. I followed his instructions, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet with each step. Strange noises emanated from behind closed doors, adding to the sense of unease that hung in the air like a thick fog. Finally reaching my room, I hesitated before inserting the key into the lock. The door groaned open reluctantly, revealing a scene straight out of a nightmare. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the furniture was covered in a layer of dust and grime. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread as I entered the room and closed the door behind me. But every creak and groan of the old building seemed to amplify my unease, and I found it impossible to relax. As I settled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, suffocating me with its oppressive weight. I tossed and turned, unable to find respite from the creeping sense of dread that gripped me. Hours passed like eternity as I lay awake in the dimly lit room, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to conspire against me, feeding my growing paranoia. At some point in the night, I must have drifted off to sleep, but it offered me no solace. My dreams were plagued by twisted visions of the motel, its corridors stretching on endlessly, its walls closing in around me like the jaws of some monstrous beast. I awoke with a start, bathed in a cold sweat, the remnants of my nightmares still clinging to the edges of my consciousness. The room was suffused with an eerie silence, broken only by the distant hum of the highway outside. I glanced at the clock beside the bed and felt a surge of panic as I realized how late it was. I needed to get out of this place, to escape the suffocating grip of its oppressive atmosphere. But as I moved to get up, a sudden noise froze me in my tracks. It was a faint scratching sound, coming from somewhere outside the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Then, without warning, the scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. I lay there in the darkness, paralyzed with fear, as the growl grew louder and closer, until it seemed to be right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting for whatever horror lurked on the other side to reveal itself. But just as suddenly as it had begun, the growling stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that was somehow even more unsettling. Morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. As I stirred awake, the events of the previous night flooded back into my mind, sending a shiver down my spine. The sense of relief at the sight of daylight was palpable, yet the memory of the eerie motel lingered like a shadow. With a heavy sigh, I dragged myself out of bed and approached the bathroom, eager to wash away the lingering unease. The faucet groaned as I turned it on, and rusty water sputtered out, staining the sink with its orange hue. Despite my discomfort, I hurried through my morning routine, eager to put as much distance between myself and the rundown motel as possible. As I packed my belongings and prepared to leave, a nagging curiosity tugged at the corners of my mind. What had caused the strange occurrences of the previous night? Was there more to the rundown motel than met the eye? With a sense of trepidation, I ventured out into the hallway, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the dim lighting did little to dispel the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. I approached the reception area, where the same gaunt receptionist from the previous night sat behind the desk, his gaze fixed on a tattered magazine. Summoning all my courage, I cleared my throat and spoke up. "Excuse me," I began tentatively. "I couldn't help but notice some unusual occurrences last night. Is there something strange about this place?" The receptionist looked up, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze piercing through me like a knife. Then, with a low chuckle, he leaned forward, his voice a whisper in the stillness of the room. "You've felt it too, haven't you? The presence that lingers in the shadows, the whispers that echo through the halls. This place has a history, you see, a darkness that clings to it like a curse." My heart raced as I listened to his words, a chill running down my spine. There was something unnerving about the way he spoke, as if he knew more than he was letting on. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist leaned back in his chair, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Legend has it that this motel was built on the site of an ancient burial ground," he said, his voice barely more than a murmur. "The spirits of the restless dead still roam these halls, seeking vengeance on those who disturbed their slumber." I recoiled at his words, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, yet there was an undeniable sense of truth in his words. "But why?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear. Why would anyone build a motel on such a cursed place? The receptionist's smile widened, a glint of madness in his eyes. For the same reason people do anything, he said cryptically. Greed, ambition, the pursuit of power. Some will stop at nothing to achieve their goals, even if it means sacrificing innocent lives in the process. With that ominous warning, he turned back to his magazine, leaving me to grapple with the unsettling revelations he had shared. As I made my way back to my car, a sense of unease settled over me like a dark cloud.